BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
When I was 25 years old, I moved in with a man who was 98. This man, whom I'll call Mr. Kessler, wasn't a friend or relative. He was a Holocaust survivor in the first stages of Alzheimer's disease, and I'd been hired to look after him. Although I had a background in clinical psychology, I was by no means a professional caregiver. I was hired because Mr. Kessler's son, Sam, thought his father shouldn't live alone. Once ensconced in Mr. Kessler's two-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, I became, as so many caregivers do, a record keeper of someone else's obsessions. Where are my keys? Have you seen my wallet? What day is it? Where do you live? Where do your parents live? He didn't ask these questions every day in the year I cared for him. He asked them 9 or 10 times a day, every day. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't. I wanted him to appreciate my efforts, but he couldn't. Some mornings Mr. Kessler knew who I was. Some mornings he did not. Some days he resented my presence. Some days he was glad to have my company. And some days, as if in gentle reproof to his own forgetfulness, he looked at me and murmured, "How long have I been like this?" Or, "Why don't I remember?" Or, "I don't know how you put up with me." As Mr. Kessler teetered between knowing and not knowing me, between wanting my company and rejecting it, between happily eating the meals I prepared and accusing me of taking advantage of his hospitality, I felt myself pulled between feeling useful and feeling like an intruder. His oscillations began to tug at my own sense of existential rootlessness. Why was I here? What was I doing? Was I doing any good at all? It was my first indication that people with dementia disorders can still find your most vulnerable part and poke at it until you yourself feel unraveled. One evening, about 7 months into my stay, Mr. Kessler haltingly climbed on top of a chair to change the battery in a smoke detector. When I warned him how dangerous this was and offered to help, he snapped, in typical fashion, that he was the boss and didn't need help. Usually, when he tried to fix things, I would distract him. But this time, for just 1 minute, I needed him to understand that there was such a thing as objective reality. "Forget about the alarm," I said firmly. "It's too dangerous." He waved me away and put a foot on the chair. Aggravated by his condescension, I felt an uncharacteristic urge to strip him of his delusions. I was tired of playing this game, tired of being his co-conspirator in the belief that nothing was wrong with him, which, ironically, made it easier for him to question my presence in his home. So I did what caregivers shouldn't. I argued. Shaking with indignation, I shouted that he didn't do anything by himself, that he always needed my help, that he wasn't capable of living alone. Although my outburst didn't seem to faze him and fled his memory after 10 minutes, it so disturbed me that for weeks I succumbed to apathy. I thought I was failing, perhaps not in my duties, but as a human being. Caregivers want to reestablish a shared reality. It's not cruelty, but desperation that drives us to confront patients with the truth. In many cases, dementia disorders create a world so fragmented, so skewed, so redundant, so indifferent to normal rules of behavior, that family members outwittingly become part of the madness. Yet clinicians and researchers continue to posit a clear distinction between the mind of the caregiver and that of the patient, between the normal and the abnormal, when in fact, the true burden for caregivers is often the absence of such a divide. Children and spouses do not merely witness their loved one's cognitive decline, they become part of it, living in its surreal, bleak reality every minute of every day. My case studies are therefore always about two people who unknowingly collaborate in misinterpreting the disease. Patient, I use the term patient throughout as a shorthand for person with dementia, and caregiver. Relying on cognitive and neurological research, as well as on my own experience, I want to show how both patient and caregiver react to the existential dilemma created by dementia. Sam's relationship with his father had been fractious from the time he had announced at 21 that he was going to be a professional musician. Mr. Kessler didn't mind Sam making noise in the house, but Sam needed to get a job first and play music second. His job, Sam told his father, was playing the tenor sax. What kind of job is that? Mr. Kessler's conviction that Sam was wasting his life was relentless. Dementia was punishing them in the same way they had always punished each other. At least once a week I heard a version of the following. Sam, stop trying to fix the lamp in your room. It's dangerous. Mr. Kessler, I don't touch the lamp. I don't know what you want from me. Sam, you mess around with the lamp and the wiring. That's how you cut your hand. Mr. Kessler, I never touch the wires. What wires have I touched? Sam, don't argue with me. Just do as I say. It's for your own good. Mr. Kessler, when do I argue with you? Sam, you always argue with me. You're always giving me trouble. Mr. Kessler, no one ever said I give anyone trouble. Sam, you're giving me trouble right now. Mr. Kessler, how? How am I giving you trouble? Sam, you don't listen to me. And if you keep arguing and contradicting me, I'll stop coming to see you. Mr. Kessler, I promise. I promise I will listen to you 100%. Sam, okay. Now promise me you'll stop touching the lamp in the bedroom. Repeat it to yourself. I will not touch the lamp. Mr. Kessler, I never touch the lamp. What lamp? Sam, God damn it, stop arguing with me. Mr. Kessler, when do I ever argue with you? While Mr. Kessler would quickly forget their arguments, they accumulated in Sam's mind until his frustration and anger boiled over, as did his guilt. Although I had grown accustomed to feeling helpless when confronted by Mr. Kessler's distress, I thought that surely I could help Sam. One day, after another bad fight, I took Sam aside and showed him photographs of the healthy brain and the dementia brain, with the hippocampus pitifully shrunk to half its normal size. Sam looked appropriately somber. Here was indisputable evidence that his father was no longer the person that Sam had been fighting with for decades. Yet only an hour after Sam viewed these photographs, he and his father were shouting at each other again. It was a lesson to me. Just as I had mistakenly regarded intimate moments with Mr. Kessler as touchstones of closeness, I mistook Sam's moment of clarity for long-term understanding. Who, I sometimes wondered, was suffering more from memory loss, Sam or his father? Because memory is biased toward pre-existing knowledge, we all edit the present to make it look like the past. No matter what new symptoms his father presented, Sam's memory encoded his father's behavior in a way that made him appear more consistent with the man he used to know. Just as Alzheimer's can magnify conflict, it can also bring out affection and tenderness, quiet moments when arguments cease. One Sunday afternoon, something unusual occurred. Sam offered to shave his father. At first, Mr. Kessler declined, but sensing that his own hand was no longer steady, he hesitantly agreed. Watching them from the doorway, I noticed that once Mr. Kessler felt the warmth of Sam's fingers and the stroke of the razor, he began to enjoy himself. And Sam took pleasure in Mr. Kessler's unabashed delight at being pampered. "You're like a professional barber," Mr. Kessler said, chuckling as Sam finished up. "I should pay you." And then, when Sam wiped away the last of the lather, Mr. Kessler leaned into him and sighed, "Oh, that's good." Sam, I knew, looked forward to these 15 minutes when he and his father could be together. So it came as a jolt when, During one of their sessions, Mr. Kessler, after telling Sam that he should be paid, casually added, "You need the money, don't you? Your hobby keeps you poor." Taken aback, Sam felt a familiar surge of anger and quickly stepped away from the sink. Mr. Kessler, unsure what had happened, turned his head and asked, "What's wrong? Why did you stop?" Sam said nothing. Stolidly, he began shaving his father again. Alzheimer's not only kept Mr. Kessler's image of himself intact, it also preserved an outdated image of Sam. Over the years, I've encountered a lot of anger from caregivers. Sam was just one of many whose anger was constantly being rekindled by a patient's moving in and out of awareness. It's almost axiomatic that in troubled relationships, caregivers would rather hold on to their anger than accept the pain of losing someone. And this reluctance to let go is only exacerbated by a disease that creates just enough ambiguity in a patient's behavior to keep caregivers from facing their grief. One evening, as Sam helped his father get into bed, Mr. Kessler looked up and said in a kindly tone, "Who are you?" Startled, Sam replied, "Your son." "My son?" Mr. Kessler said wonderingly. "How long have you been my son?" "Well, I guess 62 years now," Sam said, feeling both alarmed and amused. Mr. Kessler's eyes widened. 62 years you've been my son, and only now you're telling me?" Sam laughed. "Well, sometimes it slips my mind." Seeing his son laugh caused Mr. Kessler to laugh as well. Later, a grim-looking Sam found me in the kitchen. "Oh, I'm a jerk," he muttered. "Why do I continue arguing with him? He doesn't even know who I am." Our minds abhor ambiguity, and as long as a patient's memory flickers on and off, we tend to see what we want to see. As I continued to observe Sam's seesawing reactions to his father's intermittent and fluctuating recall, I realized that it's not the absence of a memory system that frustrates and confounds caregivers, but rather its fragmentation. Given the way a normal memory functions, memory loss in someone we know well feels less like a neurological deficit than an act of betrayal. After all, when patients forget, it's the caregivers who end up feeling erased, their words, efforts, and sacrifices often going unacknowledged and even denied by their patients. It's why so many caregivers feel they're being gaslighted. Without the other person's memory working alongside our own, collaborating with us on facts and events, we're left shaky and unsure of what's real, of what's to be trusted and not trusted. Memory loss does not just create ambiguity. It impedes the possibility of growth, of repair, of accountability, of achieving closure.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
In Greenwich Village, along one of the pleasant streets that converge near the Jefferson Market Garden, there's a small Italian restaurant, intimate, dimly lit, with red and white checked tablecloths and candles in the Chianti bottles. Sometimes, after work, Elizabeth Horn would meet her husband Mitch for a cocktail and dinner. Elizabeth would usually arrive to find Mitch, highball in hand and joking with a waiter. They'd kiss, and she'd order a Tanqueray and tonic. They had been friends before becoming romantically involved, and bantered back and forth without missing a beat. Anyone looking at their table might well have envied them, never suspecting that Elizabeth dreaded these pleasant get-togethers and their aftermath. Elizabeth, a tall, elegant woman in her late 50s, talks about those evenings in a composed, confiding tone, which only makes her story more uncanny. Because once the meal was over, Mitch would invariably give her a wary, skeptical look and say, Now you'll go to your place and I'll go to mine." Hearing these words, Elizabeth would nod meekly, duck into the bathroom, take off her heels, put on a pair of sneakers, and run out. She'd cross the street and wait for Mitch to emerge, making sure he was headed in the right direction. It always struck her how normal Mitch appeared, casually strolling along in his sport jacket and Rolling Stones t-shirt, looking pretty much like the man she had fallen in love with. It was herself she barely recognized, the nervous, frazzled woman hiding behind lampposts, following a man who looked so at ease in the world. Then, with a burst of speed, she managed to get back to their apartment a few minutes before he did. Arriving home, Mitch always gave her the same cheerful greeting. "Hey, honey, how are you?" He had already forgotten their rendezvous. The nightmare would officially begin after Mitch had made himself comfortable. Without any warning, he'd look up from a magazine or the TV, stare at Elizabeth, and ask her to leave. Calmly at first, he'd order her out of her own home. When she tried to convince him that she was home, he'd scoff. How could it be her home when he lived there? Although he sensed that they knew each other, he had forgotten they were married. Moreover, he felt threatened by her presence. In the early stages of the disease, Elizabeth had refused to give in. She'd point to things in the apartment and remind him where they came from. "Look," she'd say, "our wedding picture, see?" Unfazed, Mitch would reply, "Yeah, you must have planted it there." Nothing she said did any good. When patients have an answer for everything, caregivers get caught in a loop. It's surprisingly hard not to be goaded by a patient's responses. Even if the answers are nonsensical, the patient's ability to provide them suggests that we are still dealing with a functional mind. Indeed, that part of the mind which helps patients produce a steady stream of answers remains intact. It was this part, what the neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga has termed the left brain interpreter, that Mitch was now leaning on. The interpreter is an unconscious process responsible for sweeping inconsistencies and confusion under the rug. Although we rely on facts and logic in our daily lives, we tend to massage them when they fail to conform to our expectations. We see the same process in our visual system. When the visual interpreter falls for optical illusions or smooths over visual glitches, it does so in accordance with certain preconceptions. Similarly, our left brain interpreter fills in cognitive blind spots, hiccups, ambiguities, and gaps. Thus, the dementia patient will blame the aide for misplacing a purse or insist that people are conspiring against them. When they feel internal discord, their unconscious mind searches for an external source, and this source gives shape to their paranoia. So when Mitch was confronted by the wedding photo, evidence that Elizabeth was his wife, which contradicted his impression that she was someone else, his left brain interpreter found explanations for that evidence. For instance, that it had been planted in his apartment. The mind's propensity to create believable narratives is all too human. In a 1962 study, Stanley Schachter and Jerry Singer administered a synthetic hormone to their subjects. The hormone narrows blood vessels and can produce anxiety, shakiness, and sweating. Some participants were informed that they had been given a vitamin that had no side effects. The others were told that the pill could produce a racing heart, tremors, and flushing. Those who knew about the possible side effects immediately attributed their discomfort to the drug. Those unaware experienced agitation and blamed their environment, even thinking that the other participants were responsible. This need to ascertain cause and effect is yet another function of the left brain interpreter, and it plays out in many ways. We'll twist facts, defend misconceptions, and opt to believe whatever makes sense of what's happening around us. Sadly, caregivers like Elizabeth must contend with people who are simultaneously lucid and confused, impaired yet oddly nimble, themselves and yet not themselves. And much like their patients, such caregivers do not take this confusion lying down. After all, the healthy mind also abhors inconsistencies, contradictions, and ambiguity, which of course is what dementia disorders regularly throw at them. In effect, patient and caregiver are locked in a battle, each one determined to fend off the chaos the other one represents. So the more desperate Elizabeth sounded as she tried to convince him she was his wife, the angrier Mitch became, as if he was the one indulging a delusional person. Some evenings, he flew into a rage, grabbed her by the neck like a stray cat, and pushed her out the front door. And there she'd sit all night in the hallway. Soon, her exile became almost a nightly routine. She took to carrying a spare key in her pocket and would let herself in when she thought Mitch had fallen asleep. Telling me all this, Elizabeth added, "People always ask about the patient. How is Mitch? How is he doing? Let me tell you something. The patient is fine. It's the caregiver who's going crazy." During one of their nightly battles, Mitch made good on his threat to call the police. He dialed 911 and claimed that a strange woman was in his apartment. 20 minutes later, 2 cops arrived to find an incensed Mitch and a sobbing Elizabeth, at which point something totally unexpected happened. Mitch became Mitch again, Elizabeth told me. "How so?" I asked. "He suddenly remembered me." After the police left, Elizabeth realized that social stimulation reminded Mitch of who she was. Human interaction had washed away the agitation in his body and the chaos in his mind, thus leaving the left brain interpreter with no discord to interpret. And because Mitch seemed to know her when people were around, their friends initially didn't understand what Elizabeth was going through. This, in turn, made her worry that people thought she was exaggerating her husband's dementia, since he seemed so normal in company. At one of our first meetings, Elizabeth remembered a particularly harrowing confrontation. Instead of throwing her out, Mitch had suddenly relaxed and turned on the TV. He flipped through the channels but stopped at the opening credits to Dr. Zhivago and, hearing Lara's theme, reached out for her hand. "Imagine," she said to me, "we were holding hands." I pictured them together, sitting on a couch as romantic music filled the air, a scene that would be touching if I didn't consider what such moments did to her. "I was like an abused woman," she told me. "Always on edge. I never knew which side of him was going to come out." It was the perpetuation of the sweet Mitch that kept her off balance. Because alongside the man who didn't recognize her was the man who might stroke her hair and ask how she put up with him. Alongside the man who threw her out the door was the man who made a video for their anniversary in which he confessed how lost he'd be without her. If that Mitch did not exist, if Elizabeth had had only the delusional Mitch in her life, she would have had less to contend with. Instead, her brain was badgered by inconsistency and uncertainty. Early in our development, we attribute to other people a permanent, deep-down self. And though our understanding of people becomes more complex as we grow older, our belief in a true or real self persists. The reason that Elizabeth kept arguing with Mitch is that she was appealing to the real Mitch, the good Mitch, the one still in there, who in the past would have come to her aid. For caregivers, the idea of a real self can be a double-edged sword. If on the one hand it encourages us to argue with afflicted loved ones in the hope of breaking through to their real selves, it can be a source of great frustration. If, on the other hand, we start to doubt the existence of an essential self, how can we account for the person we're caring for? Who is it that we are suffering and sacrificing for? Seeing continuity in people is entirely natural, and real or not, the idea of an essential self has valuable, even practical applications. If we weren't built to believe that other people have essential selves, it would be too easy to become disconnected from family and friends. Nowadays, Mitch is much calmer. His confusion has ebbed along with his cognitive capacity, and so is Elizabeth. Even so, at our last meeting, Elizabeth told me that he can still, on occasion, become upset. One day, when Mitch was filling in a coloring book, something he previously would have found beneath him, he looked up and said, "I think there's something wrong with me." "Well, honey," Elizabeth said gently, "you have something called Alzheimer's, and that's okay. I'm here for you." Mitch furrowed his brow. "No, that's not it. I don't have that. Why would you even say that?" Elizabeth immediately retreated from the statement. "I felt awful getting him agitated like that," she told me. "It's hard to resist," I said. "You were trying to give your husband permission to feel confusion by explaining the source." "Yes," she said, "that's true, but you're giving me too much credit. I just wanted him to get it so both of us would know, so we could be in on it together." I nodded. For a moment, she believed she had glimpsed the old Mitch, the true Mitch, so she had confided in him in the way she had in the past, thinking he'd understand. But the moment passed, and she reprimanded herself for forgetting the lessons the disease had taught her. As she talked about it, her eyes began to well up, and I thought she was going to acknowledge, as so many caregivers do, how hard and lonely it was to take care of her husband, how there was a part of her that wished it would end. What she said took me aback. "You know, I'm very grateful for this experience in a way. Don't get me wrong, it's a terrible disease, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned about my limitations, and I guess I've learned I can survive. I have more patience than I thought. I didn't expect to, but I've learned there's still love, and love doesn't go away. Alzheimer's can't take it away."
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Henry and Ida Frankel live in a cozy 3-bedroom apartment in Manhattan's Washington Heights. Henry, a soft-spoken retired architect, is a short, handsome man with a bald head and small ears. Ida is even shorter, with fine white hair coiled in a bun. Although she is usually smartly turned out, smelling of powder and lavender, only Henry knows how much effort this entails. Whenever he tries to cut her nails, give her a bath, or change her clothes, Ida's small face contorts into something unrecognizable. She becomes like a fierce, cornered animal. Henry and Ida's families immigrated to New York from Austria in the 1930s, when both were teenagers. They met at the City College of New York, and in 1953, 1 year to the day after graduation, they were married. Allowing for the usual ups and downs, their marriage was a good one. They liked the same novels and films and shared a love of chamber music. Their apartment is lined with books and a large collection of Deutsche Grammophon LPs. In her mid-70s, Ida began showing signs of Alzheimer's. Her decline was gradual. She experienced the usual memory loss and attendant confusion, but life went on pretty much as before. Then one day, Henry came home to find Ida speaking to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. They had many photographs of departed friends and family around the apartment, and Ida began to go from one to another, telling aunts and cousins whatever she happened to be thinking about. After the initial shock wore off, Henry became used to her chatter and resigned himself to this new quirk of hers. He'd obviously known her friends and relatives, and he didn't mind their playing a role in her imaginative life. Once Ida turned 80, she also began having conversations with books, not in the sense of communing with the characters, but with the authors themselves, or, more accurately, with their jacket photos. To Proust, she might talk about her childhood in Vienna. To Virginia Woolf, she spoke of her honeymoon and how Henry had once gotten lost in Venice. To Rilke, she spoke about fashion, porcelain, and popular music. As time passed, Henry began to feel like an intruder in his own home. "She'll talk to them with the tenderness that's missing when she talks to me," a bereft Henry told me. Their shared appreciation of certain writers, which had once united them, now put a wedge between them. How was he supposed to compete? He became envious of the photographs and sometimes eavesdropped. Then when she accused him of spying, he felt terrible. One sunny afternoon when Henry and I met, he informed me that the night before, Ida had invited a guest for dinner, the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig, who died in 1942. The dinner had not gone well. After putting food on the table, Ida had directed all her remarks to the cover of The World of Yesterday, except when she asked Henry to pass a roll to their guest. This request cracked his self-resolve. "You have ridiculous delusions," he shouted. "It's a picture. Pictures do not eat. Your craziness is making me crazy." Recounting this to me, Henry smiled. It felt good telling her. But the feeling had been quickly replaced by guilt. Ida sulked and stopped eating. Touched by her vulnerability and the absurdity of his small victory, Henry had apologized and begged for forgiveness. His outburst, he confessed, had left him rattled and miserable. Henry couldn't shake off the sting of Ida's daily rejections. He knew they weren't personal, but they felt personal. Henry was, as he readily admitted, a people-pleaser. After Ida fell ill, after she no longer even recognized him, except as someone who looked after her, he still wanted to make her happy. But he also wanted her to know that he was trying to help. Mocking himself, he told me, "What do I expect? For her to say, 'Oh, you're such a good husband.'" He felt ashamed at trying to win her approval, knowing that his first concern should be her welfare rather than his self-esteem. We berate ourselves for taking things personally, for wanting the approval of people, even those who are neither cognitively nor emotionally equipped to give it. But the medial prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is activated when we think about who we are, is also activated when we reflect on how others perceive us. Neurologically speaking, there is no special place in the brain that is hermetically sealed from the influence of other people. The self is porous. So when caregivers are yelled at, lied to, ignored, unfairly accused, or not recognized, how can this not affect their sense of self? Let's consider another scenario in which three people find themselves in a nondescript room. They are volunteers in an experiment. One of them spies a ball in a corner. He picks it up and casually tosses it to another person, who then tosses it to the third. Soon they're playing a nice, unhurried game of catch until, without warning, two of the players decide to stop playing with the third. They ignore him. The person left out can only watch helplessly as the game continues without him. As it happens, this interaction is the experiment. Two of the people are confederates. The third isn't in on the secret. The game, created by the psychologist Kip Williams, is called Cyberball. And because the stakes are fairly low, we might, picturing ourselves in the role of the third person, believe we would take our exclusion from this silly game in our stride. But we would be deluding ourselves. This point was reinforced by social psychologist Matthew Lieberman. He asked people to play digital cyberball with two other players. Although the subjects believed they were playing with real people, they were actually playing with programmed avatars that eventually began to exclude the subject. As expected, a good many of the participants expressed hurt and anger over the rejection. Brain scans revealed that the area in the brain sensitive to social pain had been activated. All this could have been predicted. The real surprise came when participants were informed that their opponents were avatars computer programmed to reject them. Even after they knew it was a machine, they still experienced social pain. I thought about this experiment when Henry confessed that he was jealous of Stefan Zweig. Jealous of Stefan Zweig? He couldn't believe it. But I could. If we can become upset by computers' rejection, how can we not feel social pain when ignored, dismissed, or accused by people we know and love? Ida's dementia made her no less a person to Henry, nor did it matter that her other relationships were imaginary. What mattered was that Ida was living her life without him. Human beings, along with other mammals, have evolved to feel isolation as painful. Rejection literally hurts. The effect of loneliness on physical and emotional health is well established. The effect on cognitive health, however, has only recently come to light. Loneliness shortens attention span and interferes with judgment and self-control, the very attributes required to deal with a patient's fixations and delusions. Kathy is petite, in her late 60s, with short-cropped, shiny gray hair and a warm, tremulous voice. For 6 years, she had been taking care of her husband, Frank. Frank had always been the more religiously conservative one, and when he developed Alzheimer's, his Catholicism became more pronounced. "It's like being married to the Pope," she said. Because Alzheimer's disease routinely triggers our attachment system, that innate impulse to seek out a safe haven during times of stress, patients, in addition to fixating on their parents or childhood homes, often take comfort in religion, another secure base. But while Frank was able to sublimate his internal chaos by turning to ritual, Kathy had no one and nothing to turn to. It wasn't only his religiosity that narrowed her existence. Frank had taken to watching TV all day long. He would yell at the actors, warning them of some impending disaster. And if an attractive actress showed up, he might suddenly shout, "That woman is about to take her top off!" His impromptu yelling and ridiculous predictions sucked the joy out of everything. One evening, after a few months of this, Kathy abruptly stood up and escaped to the bathroom. "I couldn't sit there and keep my mouth shut, but I didn't want to argue with him," Kathy told me. "So I went off where I could scream." You know, if someone had told me before Frank got Alzheimer's that all I had to do was agree with him and accept his reality, I would have said, "Sure, what's so hard about that?" I should be able to take his yelling and stupid predictions. Instead, I correct him. I tell him Errol Flynn isn't going to die. I tell him Doris Day isn't going to take her blouse off. Why do I do that? I mean, what do I care what the hell he says? I should let it go. It's not his fault. Although she resented Frank for not understanding what the disease was doing to him, Kathy did not truly appreciate what the disease was doing to her. Dementia affects emotional regulation, so while we naturally expect patients to lose it every so often, we expect ourselves to keep it together. At first blush, this makes sense. Unlike the impaired brain, the healthy brain has an intact prefrontal cortex, where self-regulation takes place. Nonetheless, this is no guarantee that we can always self-regulate. Scientists have identified 2 kinds of regulation strategies in the prefrontal cortex, automatic and effortful. Self-regulation is effortful when we experience a threat whilst on our own. More energy is then required to de-escalate emotions like anger and sadness. Co-regulation, on the other hand, is automatic, meaning that threats feel less overwhelming from within a community. Hence, people in healthy and supportive relationships feel threats less intensely than people who feel alone. But that doesn't mean that a relationship is necessarily beneficial. If, like Kathy, we're technically not alone but feel alone, self-regulation becomes effortful. Is it any wonder that dementia caregivers struggle to keep their anger in check? Despite everything she did to make him feel safe, Frank still refused to crack open a window. Okay, of course, I get it, Kathy told me. I mean, the poor guy is riddled with delusions, but I do everything for him, and I can't even get a little fresh air. I get so angry about how unfair it is, and then I feel so petty and selfish for feeling this way. Kathy's reaction was understandable. Unfairness is not really about getting your own way. It's not about a shut window. Unfairness marks a loss of social connection, a feeling that one more implicit social agreement has been canceled. According to Lieberman, fairness not only feels right, it also registers in the brain as deeply pleasurable. Fairness, he writes, tastes like chocolate. There is nothing fair about a long-standing relationship suddenly becoming one-sided. It isn't fair to lose a mutual reality that once sustained the closeness that dementia is now stealing away. It isn't fair to be left alone. It doesn't feel good, and it doesn't bring out the good in us.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Min was an elderly Chinese woman with Alzheimer's disease. She had grown up in a village outside Shenzhen and arrived in the United States in her late 30s. Determined not to seem like an ignorant, unworldly immigrant, she tamped down her insecurity and adopted the persona of someone in the know. Alzheimer's may have made buying food, paying rent, and attending to her mail more difficult, but she was still her old irascible self. And because the Alzheimer's reinforced Min's disposition, her granddaughter Julia could not be sure where her grandma's habitual defenses ended and her dementia began. Julia, I soon learned, was sleeping in 2-hour shifts, a pattern that began after she moved out of Min's apartment and arranged for 24-hour care. She couldn't sleep because she knew that her phone might ring at any moment. Min would call, either to demand to know why Julia wasn't there, or to complain about the incompetent aides who apparently did nothing but wear out the rugs. One, Min declared, was dumb as a goat. Another, useless as a cow. Another, lazy as a pig. The aides also phoned all hours, upset by Min's constant abuse. 6 or 7 had already quit. Knowing how woefully underpaid these women were, Julia felt responsible for their misery, believing that Min's anger was meant for her because she had left. I asked why she was bearing all the responsibility alone. Julia thought for a moment and then plunged into her complicated family history. Min, it turns out, was not her real grandmother. Julia's mother had had an affair with a man who already had a wife and family, so Julia had ended up in the care of the permanent babysitter her father had hired, Min. Having never felt unconditional love from either of her parents, Julia took nothing for granted and sought to prove herself to everyone, especially the woman she had come to regard as her grandmother. And Min, who had no family of her own except for nieces and nephews, returned Julia's love. But for Min, love meant there could be no boundaries between them. Julia felt pulled in all directions. Not only did she have to deal with aides threatening to quit, she also had to repeatedly assure Min that she had not been abandoned. "I guess this isn't how a 20-something is supposed to live," Julia noted. "True," I said, adding, "your grandmother is lucky to have you." "I am the one who's lucky," Julia said earnestly. "She saved me. Without her, I don't know who or where I would be." When I heard this, I worried about all the ways her gratitude could be exploited by the disease, and I ended our first meeting with a gentle insistence that Julia come back whenever she felt overwhelmed. I can't say I was surprised when I heard from her in less than a week. Her favorite aide had abruptly announced that she was leaving, and Julia was in a panic. She rushed over to Min's apartment to find the aide in tears. She was crying not because Min had yelled or tried to throw her out, but because she had told the aide that she could not be trusted. Min accused her of staying only because she had a sick child at home and could not afford to lose her job. It wasn't the first time that Min had used personal information to get her way. A previous aide had been told to take the weekend off because Julia was coming to stay over. It wasn't true, but when the aide wanted to confirm with Julia, Min had snapped. "What, because I'm old, you don't trust me? I don't want to deal with people who don't trust me." The aide, young and inexperienced, wavered, and Min knew just the right thing to say to cinch the deal. "Why would you want to spend the weekend with me when you have 2 young children at home?" Telling me this, Julia gave me a sly smile and said, "My grandma is a mastermind." "Just because Min has Alzheimer's," I said, "doesn't mean that she can't scheme." Most people think that Alzheimer's impairs reason because it interferes with cognition and executive functions. It certainly does that, but this doesn't mean that victims become helpless. They remain capable of getting their own way, of making us believe them, of sucking us into arguments. Today, we know the mind and body are not divisible. The mind, whatever else it is an amalgam of the brain, the body, and the environment in which they all coexist. Reason and emotion, far from being distinct, actually overlap. So although Min's cognition was impaired, she could still feel her way through a situation, relying on emotional strategies that had served her in the past. When Julia had rushed home after Min tricked the aide into leaving, they fought. Didn't Min realize she was costing Julia time and energy? Hadn't Julia told her time and again how hard it was to get help? Didn't Min know how long it had been since Julia went out and did something for herself? Min refused to listen. She was the one who had been wronged. She was the one who had been abandoned by an ungrateful granddaughter, a person too selfish to spend the day with her grandmother. At this point, Julia had stalked out, leaving her grandma alone. Telling me this, Julia was contrite. She regretted her outburst, her indignation, and the fact that she had temporarily abandoned her grandmother. She didn't want to comply every time her grandmother called, but she also didn't want to live with Min's anger. Because whenever Min accused her of not visiting or of not being on her side, Julia's lifelong fear of disappointing her invariably surfaced. She then felt compelled to plead her case, insisting that she often visited. Min, however, took this insistence as an argument, and arguments were only more proof of Julia's disobedience and betrayal. What could she do? I told Julia what I usually tell other caregivers. A little fibbing can go a long way. She could promise to visit and not follow through. But Julia felt it was wrong to lie, and she was convinced she would get caught. "If it's important to her, she'll remember," she said. I explained that what was paramount for Min was less the truth than the feeling of being wanted. To stop her grandmother from getting angry meant learning to address the emotions beneath the accusations. Julia had to learn to speak Alzheimer's, which clinically means focusing on a patient's feelings rather than on the facts. Although Julia grasped what I was saying, she couldn't quite accept it. The idea of forsaking the truth when dealing with a loved one is not something that comes easily. I was at a loss. How could I get Julia to shake off her feelings of inadequacy and guilt when she believed everything her grandmother said? I was still worrying about this when Julia invited me to visit her and Min on the Chinese New Year. I gladly accepted the invitation, hoping that it would present an opportunity to demonstrate that Min's convictions were as mercurial as her moods. Min was small, fragile, but she was still agile. I was taken with how emotionally attuned she seemed. The fact that we didn't speak the same language did not deter us. She was amused when I was amused, and eagerly nudged Julia to explain whatever struck my curiosity. By now, I'd been around enough dementia patients to appreciate their ability to shift between confusion and amiability, which sometimes made them appear beguilingly with it. What I didn't expect, however, was how endearing I'd find Min, or how easily she would win me over with her obvious affection for Julia, taking every opportunity to touch, kiss, and caress her. At one point, they stood arm in arm, almost melting into each other. As the evening progressed, I became increasingly touched by Julia's predicament. How could she distance herself from a relationship that was as loving and reassuring as it was unhealthy? Seeing them together, I felt guilty for what I was about to do. Nonetheless, I asked Min how often Julia visited and slept over. Julia gave me a nervous smile, but dutifully translated my question. Min replied, "Almost every day," and reached for Julia's hand. Julia looked shocked. I then asked Min if anyone else helped her out. Min glanced at Julia and replied, "We help each other." "But is there anyone else?" I asked. "No," she said decisively. Julia now nudged her grandmother. "What about the aides?" "Ah," Min said, as though she'd just remembered. "They are very nice." Julia laughed and asked if she was sure about that. Min shrugged and said that although she didn't need them, they were decent, professional women. Again, Julia looked surprised. She explained to me that this was typical of Min when she was in a good mood. Of course, in a bad mood, she went on to say, Min thought that everyone was lined up against her. Was this the moment to remind Julia to believe only in this Min and not in the paranoid Min who might reemerge at any time? We expect the healthy mind to be reasonable when it comes to what we believe and disbelieve. But beliefs are intrinsically tied to feelings, and how we feel is often at the mercy of how others feel. When Min felt good, so did Julia. And when Min said nice things to her, Julia believed her unreservedly. Likewise, when Min felt agitated or paranoid, so did Julia. Sadly, all the harsh things that Min accused her of fed into Julia's conviction that she wasn't doing enough for her grandma. Julia believed Min because the mind is built to believe. Believing, in fact, is automatic. We process and comprehend statements by first assuming them to be true. We do this because it's easier on the brain to accept a statement than to question it, which is why we readily take what people say at face value. And even when caregivers know their loved ones have dementia, even when they know they shouldn't fall for what their spouses or parents or grandparents say, they still cannot help but believe them. I wanted Julia not to take Min's accusations to heart. I wanted Julia to look at the situation logically, to face reality in order to be spared any more grief. But that was presumptuous of me. The Min who showed Julia affection and kindness was no less real than the Min who yelled and derided her. How could I ask Julia to choose which Min to believe? To dismiss one would entail dismissing the other. For Julia, Min was not composed of different parts, some to be trusted more than others. When we engage with people we know and love, we feel the presence of an essential self, not a fractured, intermittently reliable brain. Believing Min, even if it caused Julia guilt and anguish, might seem an error in judgment. But as I have learned over the years, what can appear unreasonable and self-sabotaging to outsiders can actually constitute a rational trade-off for caregivers. The pain Julia felt because she took Min's hurtful words to heart was still less painful than seeing Min as someone whose words she could now and forever dismiss.
sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
When Peter Harwell's 79-year-old mother punched a doctor in the face, Peter seemed to feel the impact himself. It was his aha moment. His mother had Alzheimer's. But once he and his mother were driving home, the world began to shift back to normal. She launched into one of her rants about the medical profession, and with every word, Peter felt further removed from his moment of clarity. How could his mother have Alzheimer's when she spoke so incisively? Peter and his mother shared a passion for words, puns, puzzles, and banter. He called her his word girl, and in a professional sense, that's exactly what she was. Mary Harwell had been a respected journalist and later a star in the advertising world, when both professions had been dominated by men. People who knew Mary were not surprised by what happened at the doctor's office. As soon as she got her period, Mary's mother had needlessly dragged her to a gynecology unit. The doctor told her mother to stay outside while he examined Mary, and then proceeded to molest her. 46 years later, when she delivered a right hook to the doctor's jaw, Peter's first thought was Alzheimer's, but was it? Mary could still command a room with her conversation, and so, despite her glitches, odd behavior, and forgetfulness, Peter sometimes found it hard to accept that his mother was truly ill. After Peter's father died, Mary's condition deteriorated. The more she needed help, the more she resisted it. Making sure that she was safe while also allowing her to feel in control became a tricky balancing act for Peter. Bath time was the worst. She gradually lost interest in showering and developed infections under her breasts and in her urinary tract, which led to psychosis and trips to the hospital. Even when she did shower, she might forget to use soap. Peter then had to help her. "I don't mean to be indelicate," he told me uncomfortably, "but washing your mother, to do it effectively, you have to touch her in places that, you touch someone when you're being intimate." "I cannot imagine how difficult that must have been," I said. Peter hated seeing his mother, a formidable, brilliant, self-reliant woman, in such a helpless state. He felt he was denying her the right to make decisions about her own body, and when she yelled at him, he detected in her voice not just rage, but also the unresolved trauma of being attacked by someone she had trusted. Peter learned to power through those long minutes when he helped her shower. He'd distract her with silly lines from James Bond movies, or with the promise of watching a favorite Western. I commended Peter for how well he handled this terribly awkward task. He wasn't always patient, he allowed. It depended on which Mary he was dealing with. Some days his mother was evil incarnate, and he always knew it would be a bad day when instead of removing her robe, she'd give him one of her trademark sneers. "You want to see your mother naked? You're not exactly Ursula Andress, he'd retort. "I just showered," she'd insist. "It's been a week, and we have to worry about infections. Remember you ended up going to the hospital?" His mother had eyed him suspiciously. "You wanted to lock me up in that shithole and take all my money. You've got others fooled, but not me. I know you, little man. You're a failure. You've always been a failure. You've done nothing. I did things." Peter gave me a resigned smile. "Oh, she knows how to get you where it hurts. And I'm going to be honest. At that moment, I wanted to hurt her. I wanted to choke her right there and then." He glanced at me, wondering whether I was shocked by his confession. I simply told him the truth. "All that time alone with your mother and no one helping you or giving you a break, I can't imagine that you could feel anything else." "So what did you do?" I grabbed her by the shoulders, but then I stopped. I went to another part of the house. I texted a friend. I breathed. I was relieved, as much for Peter as for Mary. Everyone knows that living with dementia is difficult, but most people don't know that it can bring out new and unwelcome aspects of yourself. Day after day, Peter encountered more resistance to the showering. Then, on one occasion, Mary surprised him, first docilely removing her robe, then standing defiantly naked and declaring through clenched teeth, "I am not taking your goddamn shower." Seeing his mother naked, vulnerable, yet utterly unmovable, filled Peter with unbearable sadness. "Do it for me," he begged. But this only irritated her. "What are you, strange?" she taunted. "A strange boy who wants to shower his mother, to see his mother naked?" Unhinged, he fell on his knees and violently shook his head. Seeing him on all fours, Mary became confused. "What the hell are you doing?" she said. "Get up! Get up!" But he was in the grip of his own misery. Suddenly he took off his glasses and, to his amazement, crushed them in his hands. With bleeding palms, he lifted the shattered frame like a sacrificial offering. He didn't know why he'd crushed his glasses. Perhaps because he couldn't hurt his mother, he hurt himself. Perhaps he simply wanted to shock her, or perhaps by breaking his glasses, he wanted to break the repetitive loop they were trapped in. Recalling that incident for me, Peter began to laugh. It occurred to him how absurd he must have looked. "Peter," she had said, sternly but not unkindly, "have you lost your mind?" This seemed possible to him. The repetition, the anxiety, the same senseless accusations had simply become too much. He suggested they order pizza and watch a movie. She immediately brightened. A half-hour later, the pizza arrived, and Mary was content, humming along to the opening credits of a Bond film. But while Mary quickly became engrossed in the plot, Peter was still shaken. He couldn't stop thinking that he had failed as a son and as a person. By now, Peter figured, he should have learned to stop. But what is true in life becomes even more true with dementia. We get drawn into meaningless arguments even though we know they'll lead nowhere. And it isn't just a patient's habitual behaviors or the function of the left brain interpreter that creates the itch to argue. The cause is something so simple that we overlook it. Conversation itself. Conversation is easy because once initiated, it continues automatically, requiring neither deliberation nor conscious control. Dementia or no dementia, engaging in conversation is a neural habit that is very hard to resist. And because conversation is by definition social, dementia patients remain capable of verbally interacting with others long after their other faculties begin to deteriorate. Indeed, one reason Mary slipped so naturally into her role as word girl is that conversation gave her a cognitive boost. In time, the disease may sharply curtail verbal facility, and caregivers often end up carrying on conversations by themselves. This is not only psychologically painful, another way of losing a loved one. It's also cognitively draining. But as long as patients piggyback on what others say, caregivers continue to believe that they and their parent or spouse are on the same cognitive page. Although caregivers know that patients suffer from a dementia disorder, as soon as they hear the familiar protests and accusations, their brains unwittingly begin to meld with the patient's. Two brains then automatically start to imitate each other, bait each other, and tantalizingly create the illusion that true understanding is within reach. As we sat in my office, Peter asked if I had ever read Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. I nodded. "When you think about it," Peter said, "all that happens in the play is talk. The dialogue is ridiculous, it's fragmentary, but when you take it all in, the totality of it all, it starts to sound normal. Kind of like my mom and me. A lot of what goes on with us is ridiculous, but it also makes sense because it feels like at least we're doing something. All conversation is, in a sense, hopeful. By conversing, we create and acknowledge the possibility that clarity, meaning, and connection exist, even when there appears to be only strangeness and futility. And this is what Beckett understood. Language creates absurdity, but it also protects us from it. The next time Peter came to see me, he told me he thought he now understood how Mary had sucked him into those meaningless confrontations. It wasn't just the idioms and phrases that she used. She also sounded like Mom. Even her incoherent mutterings possessed a familiar musical quality. So when Peter spoke to her, he was, in a manner of speaking, carrying a tune that he had hummed innumerable times before. Peter and his mother had a comedy routine they often performed. One would pretend to desperately want something, a book, a piece of candy, a cup of coffee, it didn't matter, and incessantly plead for it. The other then pretended to become outraged and hotly refused the request. Although the origins of the joke were now obscure, the interplay, the act itself, remained fresh. Even after Mary had had dementia for years, the shtick still worked. One of the last times I saw Peter, a few weeks after Mary's death, he recalled a time when he'd visited his mother in hospice. He had found Mary in a weakened, almost somnolent state, unable to reply to his questions with anything but a weary yes or no. At one point, however, she softly asked Peter to hand her the glass of water standing on the bedside table. "No!" Peter suddenly shouted, to the horrified amazement of the nurses and visitors nearby. "You cannot have a glass of water. No water for you!" Immediately, Mary knew what was up and gleefully began to beg for the water. "Please, please, water, water, please!" The more she begged, the harsher his refusals, until once again, as always, they collapsed, shrieking with laughter. And at that moment, Peter felt that he had gotten his word girl back, the woman who teased and loved being teased. "Now, that's really Mom," he said.